What is up, everyone? Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's your guy Imprayer. We're back. We got another one coming for you today. This one we're going to be reacting to from Company Man, Twitter, the rise and fall. Very interesting because I didn't know Twitter had a rise and fall. I didn't know that was something they had going on over there. So let's go ahead and get into it, see what we can find out.
Twitter. It seems like everybody is always talking about Twitter, doesn't it? Truly, how often does a day go by where you don't hear something about them? It's very polarizing. Some people refuse to go anywhere near it, while others are on it constantly.
Sure,
but
we've all
even for
seen
the most
YouTube
active
videos
users,
about
I'm
things on
sure
Twitter.
could express some major criticisms about them, possibly about the website or about the company itself. I don't know if there's an objective way to evaluate their performance over the years, because there's been so little consistency. Aside from their public disagreements, I'm talking about their financial fluctuations, changes in leadership. For heaven's sake, look at their stock price. I mean, what do you make of that? Long term, obviously, it hasn't been the best investment. If you had bought it when they first went on the market in 2013, you would have gone through some stressful ups and downs, and after more than 8 years, you would be very close to where you started. So much of this is up to interpretation, depending on who you ask and when you ask it. So for this video, I want to talk about how Twitter became so popular in the first place, and then highlight some issues they've had that have hindered their success. Evan Williams was the co-founder of a company called Imprayer Labs in 1999, who became best known for their free blogging software called Blogger. It sounds like an obvious name, but not as much as you would think, because it was their product that actually helped make that word more popular. After 4 years, he sold that company to Google, and after briefly working for them, he quit so he can start a new company called Audio. Now, this one was a consumer podcasting company with some unfortunate timing. It was formed exactly 8 months before Apple added podcasts to iTunes, making it extremely difficult to compete with them. It was an event that caused Evan Williams and the rest of Audio to give up on podcasting and seriously rethink the direction of the company. They were in a desperate search for new ideas, and that is where Jack Dorsey enters the picture. He was a computer programmer with a background of writing code for transportation dispatch companies, but was now an employee of Audio with a promising idea. In short, he envisioned a service where you could send out messages to the public about what you were doing or what was happening, and then others could follow those messages in real time, and then they would also be archived on the internet. It was an idea that he had first thought of about 5 years earlier, but the recent advancement and popularity of SMS technology now made it much more practical. When naming the service, it's a little strange because they came close to actually calling it Twitch. Of course, it was years before the streaming service. According to Jack Dorsey, they felt that the name would be fitting because it described the vibrating of your phone when you received a message. I guess they opened up a dictionary, found the word Twitch, and then saw the word Twitter nearby. You know, the first 4 letters are the same. And then when it was defined as a short burst of inconsequential information, that was much more fitting. And I should also mention that the whole project was very much a group effort. There were other individuals like Biz Stone and Noah Glass that were extremely important in the formation in the early days of Twitter. But it was Jack Dorsey who put out the first ever tweet on March 21st of 2006, kind of a legendary moment. Just setting up my Twitter, it's so appropriate because exactly as he had envisioned, he was tweeting about what he was doing. Actually, the company resisted calling it a tweet at first. They wanted to call it a status update, but people just kept calling it a tweet, so they eventually embraced it. And as a side note, that tweet was purchased in 2021 as an NFT using almost $3 million in cryptocurrency, and that may have been the most modern sentence that I have ever said. All of those earliest tweets were made by Audio employees until July of that year when the platform was first made available to the public. Then in October of that year, they formed a separate company called Obvious Corp that bought Twitter and the rest of Audio from the existing investors, and then in April of the following year, Twitter was spun off into its own company. One of
That's actually kind of crazy.
Is not the best.
I actually just saw this past week where that actually sold like that for that much. I want to say the thing I saw, somebody was trying to resell it, I believe. The person who originally bought it, they were attempting to resell it in an auction, but apparently it did not sell. I'm not sure though. I didn't do a lot of research on that.
Their first big breaks actually happened about a month before that at the 2007 South by Southwest conference. Twitter was like the new big thing going on around there. People were using it to stay in touch and meet up with each other, and then the company embraced that popularity by setting up these big plasma screens at the convention center to display some of the messages that were being sent, sort of letting people know about it and getting them curious as to what it is. The result was actually tripling their user base during the course of it. Alright, getting to the issues with Twitter, the first one, and potentially the most troubling to the company itself, is the their lack of profits, because Twitter does not really make much money. In fact, they have lost money through most of their existence. Though I do want to point out that 2021 fell into the negative because of an $800 million legal settlement dating back 5 years, so that year would be looking much better otherwise. Part of the issue there has to do with stock-based compensation, where they pay their employees by giving them stock in the company. It's a common thing to do, especially in technology companies like this, but Twitter does it more than most, to a point where it can be concerning. The problem with it is that it dilutes the stock by creating more shares, and then it lowers the profits because it's reported as a non-cash expense. In 2015, they did lay off 8% of their workforce in an effort to cut costs and hopefully raise their profits. Then, on the revenue end, most of their money comes from advertising in the form of promoted tweets, promoted accounts, and promoted trends. Basically, the idea that they have so many people using the platform and they have this proprietary algorithm that can ensure an advertiser that their stuff could be promoted to a lot of people and to the right people. But the criticism is that the system hasn't been as effective as you would hope given their large user base. But then, that leads me to their second issue, difficulty in growing their user base, because the number of people using Twitter regularly has dramatically slowed down. Looking at the graph, their monthly active users stopped increasing as fast in 2015 and even went down for the first time in 2018, the final year before they started reporting those numbers differently. And when we isolate just the users in the United States, the slowdown, I think, is even more dramatic. For comparison, in 2021, Instagram surpassed 2 billion monthly active users. For the first few years of Twitter, this was the only metric that they truly cared about. Like many companies, the plan was to raise money from investors who believed in the future of the company, use that money to keep things running and build a sizable user base, and then finally start monetizing that user base and ultimately generate profits. They never even tried to make any significant revenue until 2010 when they introduced those promoted tweets. But then, once they stop attracting new users and are still having issues with profits, that's when things become concerning. However, I do want to mention that since 2019, Twitter has been instead reporting monetizable daily active usage. It's a different metric, but it does suggest improvement in that area, mostly in the international market. So I think the logical question at this point would be, why has Twitter had so much trouble attracting users? And I think my next few issues on the list will help answer that question. A fair amount of the criticism toward Twitter simply has to do with the fact that it can be hard to use. I know I've had difficulty at times. I think it's funny how on the Twitter Help Center website, they have a question that says, why is Twitter so hard to use? And then they reply to it by saying, it's really not, we promise. In 2016, during an earnings call, their CEO at the time, Jack Dorsey, said, we are focusing a lot of our energy on refining the core product and looking at what is confusing about the surface, what is inhibiting growth. Not only admitting to having confusing parts, but in a way acknowledging that they've been a factor in holding the company back. I don't want to get lost in the specifics of it, but people have had issues with the threads, the replies, the character limit. Oh my goodness, the character limit. They famously held on to that 140 character limit for over a decade before making the controversial decision to double it in 2017. People were concerned that the tweets would be too long and rambling and less understandable, but I don't think it turned out to be much of an issue. After a year, their data showed that only 12% of tweets were longer than 140 characters anyway. So I imagine that many people have shied away from Twitter over the years simply because it can be hard to use. Another issue facing Twitter and almost certainly keeping people away from it would be their issues regarding harassment or abuse or trolling or bullying or anything along those lines. Of course, all things that can be found all over the internet.
I know a lot of people get
in
trouble or caught up by attempting to send a DM,
things can
but
get pretty toxic
actually
on there,
adding the person instead.
Decided to delete their account or at least take breaks from it. I have to think that the character limit is a contributor to the issue and that it doesn't allow people to fully explain or express their statements or opinions. That can lead to unproductive discussions, or to take it a step further, the whole miscommunication issue.
The character limit,
how many tweets out there
it's occasionally an issue.
And that's exaggerated when people are passionate about something like news or politics. Yeah, I know, we are heading into touchy subject matter here, but Twitter has for a long time been associated with news and politics. The person that currently has the most Twitter subscribers is Barack Obama. Back in 2012, when he was re-elected as the US president, before he made a speech or anything else, he announced that victory over Twitter. Obviously, Donald Trump has been heavily associated with the platform as well, being among the most followed accounts before having it permanently suspended due to a risk of further incitement of violence. It was connected to the tweets that he made about the riots on January 6th, and that leads me to their final major issue, censorship. And this one is complicated, to say the least. There's obviously an issue on Twitter.
That's what
regarding
Elon
harassment
Musk had
and
an issue
misinformation and
with.
everything I just talked
Was the
about.
censorship
Well,
part,
their
I
main
think.
attempt to address that has been to discourage it by adding labels, deleting tweets, suspending accounts. But there is so much ambiguity involved. How do you determine what is acceptable and what isn't? How do you set the rules and enforce them consistently? What one person may see as bullying or violence, another person may see as a simple expression of opinion. I don't know. It gets heavy. I'm not saying I have the answers here. As far as I'm concerned, it's like an impossible problem to solve. But many have criticized the way that they've approached it. When Elon Musk made his bid to buy Twitter, he essentially implied that Twitter doesn't allow free speech and are holding themselves back because of it. It's a belief that's shared by many others and opposed by many others. I'm sure you could tell that I'm trying to be very careful to objectively present the issue. If at any point I sounded like I was taking a stance on one side or the other, I promise you I was not. That is not my intention in this. I simply want to present the issue and the fact that it has been negatively impacting the Twitter company. To summarize, even though Twitter continues to receive negative attention and are still very much facing all these issues, I would say the company is looking healthier now than they did a few years ago. In fact, thanks in part to their international growth, they've been reporting some of their highest ever sales figures. They had set an aggressive goal to double their revenue over a few years' time, and they are in the process of it. Overall, it depends on how you look at it. Things could be better, there's no doubt about that, but in many ways, they have been worse. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about Twitter? Would you say that they are declining without much potential, or are they on the right track? If you happen to be an avid Twitter user, I'm curious, why do you use it, and do you have any criticisms about it? Or on the other end, if you don't use Twitter, what's keeping you away from it? Was it something I talked about, or was it something completely different? Because as I always say, this was not a complete list. It's just what appears to be the biggest issues for a company that hasn't quite lived up to its potential. And a final note, please just keep it cool if you can, and any other thoughts you have about Twitter or anything else, leave them in the comments.
All right. That was interesting. That was pretty good. I myself have occasionally taken breaks from Twitter. I've been using Twitter for a long time. But yeah, I mean, I guess it has its ups and downs. I think it'll be around for a long time. I think with what Elon wants to do, it'll be around even longer. But we'll have to see. That's all for that one. See you guys in the next one.